Buenos días.
Oh, good afternoon. So, for the Foundation Against Hunger, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the socialization meeting of findings for conflict, peace, and protect food security from Triple Nexus, which is transmitted from the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana in Bogota, Colombia. Now, we greet the people that are here with us from different places of the globe through our channels in Spanish, English, and French from our YouTube channel, Action Against Hunger Colombia. In this, we're going to explore the synergies between conflict, peace, and food security, understanding the challenges that arise between. And all of this is possible thanks to the support of the Basque Cooperation Agency for Development and also by ECHO and AECID, who has supported us in our project called Hunger and Conflict. This in partnerships with Pontificia Universidad Javeriana and also with the University of the Basque Countries. Now, for action against hunger, this food security approach in conflict and peace is key because we are willing to position new narratives and debates and proposals in order to broaden the reflection and global action, not only in the context affected by the armed conflict, but also in places of reconstruction and reconciliation after direct violence has ended. Now, in today's agenda, we have 5 people that are going to be with us, showing us the Conflict and Peace Project, and they're going to open the debate for further questions that we have thereon in our live session, and also for questions that we have in our Spanish, English, and French sessions. And we ask of you, please, to write down also your questions in the YouTube channel. So, with us is John Orlando, Country Director for Action Against Hunger Colombia, and also Cristina Fernandez of de Simon. She is advocacy technician and institutional relationships of Action Against Hunger Spain. And in the case of the presentation of the food security report for conflict and peace, with us is Mateo Echeverri, researcher leader for food security, conflict and peace of Action Against Hunger Colombia, and also for the presentation of the report Landmines and Food Security in Colombia, we have Maria Camila Granados, researcher of the Information Management and Knowledge Unit. And for further reflections and conclusions, we thank the participation of Manuel Salamanca, teacher and researcher of Pontificia Universidad Javeriana. So I want to now give the mic to John Orlando, country director of Action Against Hunger Colombia, who is gonna just state a couple of welcoming words. Thank you, Carolina. So, good day, all. First of all, I'm gonna put on my glasses because otherwise I won't be able to read. So, cordial greetings from Bogota this morning, and above all, for the people that are listening to us from other corners of the globe. Buenos dias. Good day, everyone, for French and English speakers over there. Now, as country director of Action Against Hunger Colombia, it's an honor to open the space, food security, conflict, and peace. And in order to share the work that our teams have developed hand in hand with the Javeriana University and the University of the Basque Country. And as Carolina stated, this work also has the support of Basque cooperation, also has been supported by Spanish cooperation and the EU. And without said support, this research would have been impossible. And the struggle against the causes and consequences of hunger are the heart of our mandate as a humanitarian organization, and the need of understanding the transformation and dynamics of it makes us not only strengthen our narratives, but fundamentally our intervention. That is to say, all the analysis that we perform from Action Against Hunger should be able to be transformed in an improvement of our actions in the field, that is to attend populations that we serve. Work presented today are part of a process in which Action Against Hunger is struggling against since 2018, and accompanying the issuing of Resolution 2417 of 2018 18 of the UN Council, where they condemned explicitly the use of hunger as a weapon of war. Now, in Colombia, this work has been materialized through 2 years of research in a project called Hunger and Conflict, with 6 reports and multiple spaces of socialization with local, national, and international actors. A couple of days ago, we presented a couple of results in the Parliament of the Basque Country in Vitoria, and many meetings were held in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Spain and also the Office of Spanish Cooperation in Madrid. Now, in this space is Mateo, that will later talk to us, and Manuel, teacher, were a couple of the main actors of these exchanges. Now, conflict, as we've seen in the central intervention of the space, is the main cause of a food insecurity at a global level. Now, we must understand the impact that this implies for many populations and territories. I mean, armed conflicts such as the one in Colombia show the impact that actions such as displacement and confinement have, generally speaking, but especially in the right to food for the most vulnerable populations in the country. Now, food security, as we are also going to see, has characteristics that make of it a central vehicle in order to support the efforts to build peace-building efforts. That is, we consider that this analysis are actually an opportunity, a meeting point between peoples in order to build trust and generate mutual agreements between stakeholders. So we hope that this research, that, as I insist, are action-oriented, can make visible the debates that establish the links between food insecurity, conflict, and peace. Now, in Action Against Hunger, we believe that it's fundamental to put food security as a fundamental front in order to build a peaceful and fair society. I mean, it is a mandate where all of us can meet and greet. Thank you for your presence and participation. Thank you, John, for your welcoming words. Now we are going to listen to Cristina Fernandez de Simon, technician of advocacy and institutional relationships of Action Against Hunger Spain, who is going to provide a global context of hunger and the advocacy task that Action Against Hunger has performed in Spain and, well, generally speaking, throughout the missions in Latin America. So, good day, good afternoon also to all. We're here present in many parts of the world. Thank you very much for listening us today. So, the motive of me being here is the following. 800 million people suffer from hunger currently, out of which 200 million approximately suffer acute hunger. That is, their life is at risk. Now, these figures are easy to state, hard to digest. Now, hunger that has a trend of improvement during the 90s, unfortunately, has taken a step back in the last decade. As of 2014, hunger figures started to increase once again, and especially as of 2019. And this is due to many causes, which we are going to delve in during these presentations. And, well, also it is fruit of an increasing inequality in the countries, between countries, and also at regions in the world, because Africa continues to be the continent that suffers this problem the most. So this means that each night 1 out of 5 people are going to bed hungry. Now, hunger is the main cause behind 50% of child deaths. That is, newborns or children of 5 years or less. Now, this reality is hard to understand. I mean, also knowing that hunger can be cured and can be prevented. Now, 80% of boys and girls that suffer from malnutrition and have treatments in order to, well, treat this fragile state of health can be cured, but the reality is that currently only 20% of these boys and girls have access to these types of treatments. And to invest in nutrition is highly profitable. $1 of investment in interventions, direct interventions in order to treat malnutrition, gives $23 of economic benefits. But inaction means a yearly economic cost of $3.5 billion at a global level. And I believe that these data points show the need of entering into political and financial commitments in order to end malnutrition, in order to fight hunger, and not only to end this level of human suffering, loss of life, but also due to the huge socioeconomic cost that this implies to all. And this cost is assumed at a worldwide level. Of course, directly, people who suffer from hunger individually is a very pronounced problem. Now, the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development includes within its objectives zero hunger. This is the SDG number 2. Now, we understand that to eliminate hunger and malnutrition in all of its forms is a fundamental question in order to promote development. In change, we find that goals to end malnutrition are actually retreating. That is, we are not advancing fast enough, but rather we are facing a retreat. Now we are, as of 5 years of finishing the 2030 agenda for the SDGs, and if we don't take urgent measures in order to end preventable deaths of newlyborns and children of 5 years or less, many of the countries, that is middle income or low income countries, will never achieve the SDGs, and 35 million children will die until 2030. So I reiterate, this is preventable. This can be solved. We still can do a lot. Now, access to safe diets that are sufficient and nutritional is a fundamental human right. But it is not only a right, it is a crucial determinant in order to develop the full potential of everyone. Now, childhood is logically a determinant stage even before birth, because it is fundamental to have an adequate nutritional intake in order to develop the cognitive intellectual abilities and later on to have an appropriate school performance that of course will be reflected in adulthood and productivity. And this is not only at an individual level, but it has a socio-economic impact for each person, but also for their families, and also at a country level, and of course at a global level. So this question is fundamental for many people, so they can actually break off of poverty. So at the moment of birth and even before, the impacts at this stage will transcend throughout a person's life and will have an impact on the complexity of our world, the world that we live in. Now, food insecurity, as we've already mentioned previously, is derived from different causes. Of course, we face inequality, fragilities, structural issues mainly, but currently there are 3 determinants that are actually triggers. They trigger acute hunger. On the one side, we have climate crisis, on the other hand, economic crisis, but currently the main factor that provokes acute hunger are, well, the armed conflicts throughout the world. As of 2019, we face increase where the number of armed conflicts have been increasing. The fragmentation of armed groups, internal armed conflicts are occurring, and they're becoming international, which makes conflicts nowadays become even more complex, harder to understand and harder to solve then. This then leads us to understand that currently humanitarian needs within conflicts will be multiplied, and even in recent years we face a tough reality, specifically for the humanitarian sector. And this means that we face a series of restrictions in access to the populations that face these humanitarian needs. And we face difficulties in order to maintain the security of humanitarian organizations, a safe operational environment, but also the affected populations face great restrictions in order to access aid and basic services. So, from Action Against Hunger, we work in order to end the causes and consequences of hunger in the world, in order to save lives, increase the capabilities of communities, and also to transform the systems in such a way that all can have a guaranteed food security. Now, due to the current situation of conflict and how it impacts civil population or vulnerable populations, as of 2019, we started a global initiative called Action Against Hunger, hunger and conflict basically, which has a priority that is basically to serve population that face the greatest needs, because most of them are in the context of a conflict. But also within this initiative, what we tend to do or try to understand and better comprehend how these dynamics between conflict and food insecurity relate each other in order to build enough knowledge from a research point of view and obviously field experience in places where nobody goes to, in order to promote a humanitarian diplomacy where people can protect other people, and through which we can make armed groups reduce their violent actions that deprive food from people, and a final purpose to promote international humanitarian law. Now, food security for Action Against Hunger is much more than just feeding people. Obviously, it's access to food, but it's also nutrition, health, water. It is access to basic services, social protection. I mean, this development, this gender equality. And we consider that perhaps it can also be a fundamental element in peace building. Oh, thank you very much.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias a
Okay, thank you, Cristina, who has provided a wide concept about nutrition. Now we want to give the space and provide the microphone to Mateo Echeverri, who's the person in charge of hunger, food security, conflict, and peace in Colombia, so he can introduce the report about food security, conflict, and peace against hunger in collaboration with all the organizations that have been supporting us. Okay, go ahead, Mateo. Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, all. What we are going to share with you is the report that, as was mentioned by Cristina, has long spoken, and is Action Against Hunger. And we are starting with figure. Well, speaking about what Cristina said, 135 million of people around the globe suffers from insecurity, food insecurity related with armed conflict. This is a crucial topic that to understand that conflict generates hunger, and we are seeing it around the news every day. Well, this is obvious, something obvious, but has an important milestone that has been mentioned by different speakers. That this resolution 2417 of 2018 United Nations Security Council, this resolution states that there's the need to break that vicious circle between armed conflict and food insecurity. There's a relationship. Historically, it has been used food as an arm, but we have to be more clear and explicit to state and to make it considerably rejected. For us, it's important for this type of reports, for this type of projects, because as John was saying, it's in the core of our mandate. And this report that we are going to show you, this framework that we're going to show you, is key because for us it's strategic, globally speaking, to understand this relationship, food security, conflict, and peace. This has been an evolution that we've been doing from 2019 within the framework of hunger and conflict, but we have to consider peace. And what does peace has to do? This is the other part of the coin. This is a process that has been accumulating with the work of different contexts, not only in Colombia, Niger, Palestine, Congo, amongst other countries, where we have been able to learn and understand many things, and that we need to give that additional step to see what does this has to do with peace. What is this new step we need to do? And as John was mentioning, the research that we are doing to action against hunger is to change realities. We need to change realities. So what we need with this research, it needs to become on a model, real models, and to create knowledge around many things that don't receive many information, with this link, food security, conflict, and peace. Okay, really fast to what we have been able to do, and to put this around the context, we have done different reports that we have done, not only in a department, but thematics also, understanding restrictions to mobility, the crisis of the illicit crops, also the devices that Camila will go deeper about this, and other things that we have ongoing, also topics, but on childhood and also food security, conflict, and peace. Now, let's start asking ourselves what's food security. Food security is like a plate. This is a plate. A plate that, in accordance to nutritionists, is vegetable 50%, 25% protein, cereals. But most importantly, it's more than a dish. A dish talks about the ways of understanding conflict. Here is where you can read, but also peace. A plate is a way to read the economic. When you travel and you see what you are served, you can understand what is produced, what's cultural, what's social relationships, and even who's cooking, and also environmental, what type of environmental features are being given to have some foods. But what's most important is, how do I feel this dish? Sometimes it's what we don't see. This dish is full. Well, this is somehow the dimensions of food security. With availability, I feel the dish, understanding what is produced around this plate. Access, if I have the capacity to buy them, can I go to a market? Can I buy them? Usage, because how can I transform those food? What nutritional characteristics, but also water, energy available, and stability. Are they always available or not? In the case, as John was mentioning about impacts, what can result as a combat or can result on a confinement and the incapacity to have access to those foods. And this plate may break. Why? For these three reasons. And Cristina has explained a little bit part of the global crisis report that are the three most important causes of hunger around the world. Armed conflict, we're going to go deeper about this, but also extreme weather events. These topics that are always harder, these impacts, phenomenon El Nino, are intense rains that are harder, these droughts that are long lasting, but also economic crisis. what happens with this. And the economic crisis and the extreme weather events and armed conflicts, sometimes they come together. And these are like the perfect storms of hunger for hunger. Now, let's talk about armed conflicts because this is the most important cause for hunger. Three characteristics. Four. First, contextual characteristic. Conflicts have figures, but they are really different. They have a cultural, social, there are always different features, and we need to see them quite close. They have typologies, international, internal, but there are also violences that are done inside those boxes. They don't fit, and there are important urban violences that sometimes they are not featured, but they have an important impact around that think that it's going to be around the plate. Dynamic. Armed conflicts are always changing. For example, in Colombia before 2016 is different. And there are those transformations around areas, actors, impacts, ways of being. And finally, differential. It is important for us from action against hunger. Those conflicts have specific impact in different peoples, territories, and individuals. Women, children, the impact around rural communities, always there's a differential impact. Let's say that we have phases of conflicts. There are always much more complex. The dynamics are different, but in order to simplify, let's think about these three phases. One before, when I'm going to start, when we have that attention. One, the other during, when that plate starts to break, and one after, post-conflict. I don't know if you have seen a Japanese tradition to repair what's broken, but that's moment when we do that process to try to repair that plate. So, first of all, we have the pre-conflict before they have important particularities because we don't know what that conflict is going to be materialized. They are uncertain. When there are some tracks, and in the case of Colombia, it is clear. We see armed structures that are stronger. There's a territorial control around some areas. There is an escalation of somehow a high impact type of violence, a much more marked violence. And what's most important about food security, the perception of risks makes it possible that many times it will materialize in the impact on food security and livelihoods. More clear? It does not need to occur an armed conflict. The only threat is unique to occur some things that will not be investing in agricultural topics or that some suppliers or some commerces will be closing. So what's more difficult is not having a direct violence, but this is the beginning of what hunger will be. Then we have the conflict per se during, when we can see that this violence has an impact around production, access, and everything around the use of food. Around these conflicts and what we have seen with typologies around the globe is that it is used, food is given directly to generate hunger when or indirectly. But more than this, any armed action around the conflict that will not be directly addressed as an international humanitarian law, this will have an impact on violence. And also, something important, the conflict generates economies. Vulnerabilities of populations are going to be articulated here. Economies of war. How can we break this? This is one of the most important challenges because the population has high vulnerability conditions. And here to see what is that type of impact of food security? For examples. One, Camila will go deeper about this with childhood. In mines, if we have mines, many times we cannot produce food locally because we are going to lose territories. Two, access. And this is a study that we did from a confinement, which this is one of the most important topics. The thing is that if Colombia cannot move, they cannot go to the market, they cannot go to have livelihoods. So the conflict breaks directly access, usage that we were saying, not only what we have only to they have food and the environment. What happens with conflicts and the economies of wars with the illicit extraction of minerals and illicit crops? This also has a high impact within the quality of water that people can consume. Colombia is the country, globally speaking, per capita, with a great contamination of mercury. And this is stability, because if there are combats and there are confinements, well, obviously, when am I going to be able to go to buy and go to the market or the source? So these are examples of the conflict, and particularly in Colombia, impacts directly on the different dimensions of food security. And let's talk about post-conflict. This is really complex as well, because let's say in Colombia we're not in post-conflict, we are in post-agreements, but let's see when we are by in any type of armed conflict process, let's think about something else. These are processes that are fragile, are more wide. Not only when we land on peace, these are complex, these are fragile, multiple risks of setbacks. In accordance to the FUSIN, most of conflicts have risk of setbacks and direct in the framework of 10 years. Within this, we have tensions, violence, topics that have not been treated, and we need to manage it, and food security will have an important role. And this is even fragility in post-conflict context also include state institutions. We need to go back. We need to go there. And what happens with this around this context with food security? Although there are moments that we can invest more, think about the peace agreement. There are moments to invest, to go. There are three central challenges. First, reconversion. The conflict also generates war economies that are not sustainable, that have huge impacts around communities, about the civil population, but to go and recover combatants with economies that are part of the conflict are one of the most important challenges, because all of a sudden we cannot do this reconversion. Second, rehabilitation of areas. We're going to talk about mines. We thank the report to the Danish Council, because they have a lot of challenges of post-conflict, how we can go back to those areas that have to be rehabilitated. Land mines are a challenge in a short, medium term. And finally, impairment and destruction of capitals. We see populations that, although war has passed, there are populations that need humanitarian assistance, because after 4 confinements, 2 displacements, and more, they used all their facing strategies, savings, inputs, everything they did to face the war. So these are settings where food security has also huge challenges. When the direct violence stops, the challenges still continue. And then we have one of the most important questions. This is the landscape we have. How can we protect that plate? Because we, as organizations, what can we do for that plate? How can we prevent it to break? Then we have 4 opportunities to protect that plate. What we do, hunger against action against hunger from the development field, and peace building. So these are fields that we say fields. We say fields because they have people, they have frameworks, resources that are really different between them. Now we're going to see that reality is even more chaotic and diffuse, but apart from this, we can develop it from these 3 fields. And within this, we need to understand a world that sounds a lot, and with the triple nexus. The triple nexus is a current, is a drive motor that has been provided, or how can we articulate in the different fields: humanitarian, development, peace building, around 3 simple fields. Collective objectives. If I come to the humanitarian, development can be also constructed, peace building can be constructed. It's logic. Comparative advantages. Each one can place one specific topic, a clear expertise within this type of points. And multi-year framework. Sometimes, and in the case of humanitarian, we think on a short term, because sometimes this is our nature, emergencies. However, changes and transformations have frameworks that are even longer. And what we can see and what we want to do and put on top of the table is that food security is a vehicle around everything. We believe many times that we agree on that big goal, but no, we can say, let's think about more with humbleness. Each one of us are interested in food security for a specific role. For humanitarian field, well, the basic need for subsistence, the assistance that we provide is for this, to save lives, right? But also, it's a vehicle to stabilize and to create and establish resilience. In the humanitarian, we need to not go back. How to provide tools to not go back to crisis. In the development field, this is like a vehicle for growth. We talk about food security to create growth, and in peace building field, this is a vehicle for transformation that enables sustainable peace. And this is somehow what we think is the figure what can be Colombia can be when we put these three together with the conflict stages and how each one can be worked. Here, food security is around these three, but the fields are more flow better, much more, and they cross with development, with post-conflict, and sometimes from our desktops is easy, but in other works. But in the reality is difficult. The fields sometimes occur at the same time, but yes, sometimes when we have so many violence, humanitarian has to provide a space so the other fields, there's no clear rule. But yes, there is a way of starting to assemble this map of how we can assemble all these three fields. And this is somehow what we say and believe it's fundamental to understanding this transit between before, during, and after food security. This has to be an intervention when we reduce vulnerabilities and we create capacities. Key, agency. Communities are always going to have an agency. Communities is not a passive instrument. We need to provide, we need to interact, we need to recognize capacities. But in different moments, in different times, we have sometimes when we need to reduce vulnerability. So war will not, with war we won't be breaking that plate. We can build capacities that will be providing stability. Then in order to move a little bit this map of what we can do for that, a map is the areas of action. We need to understand what can we do in the different moments for that plate. And these fields are knowledge. We need to understand the dynamic change. They change. We need to be around the context. So this plate before, during, and after, we need to have knowledge. We need to monitor. We need to learn and provide institutional learning. We need also, this is a word that it's complex, anticipate to armed conflicts, because many times we don't know if there will be or not occurring, and we need to strengthen anticipation before this conflict will be given. We need to mitigate. We need to prevent suffering. This is the concrete definition. During conflict, we need to prevent. And prevent is interesting because it's during the conflict, not to escalate, but also in the post-conflict in order to not go and have a setback. Also, we need to think about the early recovery. This is an action where we need action against hunger. We need to design this process, that link between when we can assist and a little bit beyond, but creating bases to have a better, and that's grassroots to create better recognition. One step beyond what we can do around that conflict with food security. We need to think about reconciliation, and we are going to go deeper about that dimension of reconciliation. And 4, reflections on the mapping of what we can do to defend that plate. 3, the first one, food security is around everywhere, before, during, and after. We are everywhere. This is a fundamental vehicle because nobody can cut this topic. The reality is even harder, and the actors and actions can vary. The humanitarian organizations do a little bit more. They do development, and somebody develops something about humanitarian. So always those limits are sometimes blurry, but this is what's most interesting. 3, everything at the same time in the same place as the movie. This is like nature, chaotic sometimes, because in Colombia we have 8 armed conflicts that are open. We are doing many times mitigations, recovery, and reconciliation at the same time. And this is good. We need to start learning in chaos because these are the same logics.
And last, nobody can do anything. All can do anything. It has a triple nexus. People, sometimes it's hard to do everything at the same time, and sometimes it's just impossible. I mean, what we need to understand is how we work on a step-by-step basis in order to reduce vulnerabilities and increase capabilities. And last, in order to close my presentation, I just want to tell you how can we jump from that dish in order to think about peace now. To define peace is basically an umbrella term where many definitions fit. And it's quite interesting because when we talk about peace, we talk about many things at one go. I mean, there is a spatial component. We build peace before or during, and also the target peace is to end direct violence or to transform society. Then we talk about actors. Do we do this from the local point of view or from the Security Council? We talk about levels, up or down, and last, activities. Peace building activities, or it is a result. In reality, the most important thing for us, and from our perspective here, is to think that we need to consider strategic vision of peace, because we need to organize it from top down with all of the resources and perspectives, because there is no list or specific way of creating peace. We need to mutate, understand, transform, and reread the context. So we beyond this long definition that we found in the Kroc Institute, we liked 6 institutes. Peace building as an element of relationships between stakeholders. I mean, it creates networkers. Peace building as structural transformation. I mean, we need to change. As many types of intervention, as we said, what is done before, during, and after this different elements and actions. Also, multiple levels. This is built at a township in Putumayo and also in the United Nations Security Council and anything in between. Also, we need to build fair and resilient societies. I mean, it's not only do what we did before, but be better. And last, integrate different dimensions of analysis, because peace is related to everything, with the environment, gender, everything. And this is where we stated that dish can include many of those elements that we consider in peace building, relationship between stakeholders, transformation, and multiple issues. Yes, why? Because let's talk about relationship between stakeholders now. In the case of Colombia, this is one of the initiatives that was built out of the peace accords with the demobilized FARC, which is an association where we work with the communities. It's a space where we work on food security, but it's a place to get together. I mean, food security has the potential to get people together, stakeholders at many levels, to structural transformations. It is not in vain that the first point of the peace accords talk about the rural transformation, where food security is key. Multiple forms of intervention in different modalities, and what we consider from a food security point of view, and this is something that we did in MIDE, we consider that in different moments we can do different things with food security that can generate greater capabilities and decrease vulnerabilities at multiple levels also, because food security, for example, Estadio Putumayo, that we have family food security, that's what we do. And rather, we can also talk about systems. This is basically an example of different levels. Now, the construction of fair societies, because constructing resilient agriculture needs to be thought about from a climate point of view, because we cannot consider any intervention without taking into account climate change. And also, we need to integrate multiple levels of analysis. And we need, for example, to think about gender, ethnic asymmetries, age differences, etc., etc. And this is what we want to do. Prepare, rather, a dish where food security has a material dimension that is able to transform reality and improve processes, but also to relate, to link people, because it generates networks and new melting pots, and also generate resilience. That is, not go back to the old conflict, but be resilient against new shocks, and increase the capability of peace and reduce negative impacts. So what can be done? What can food security do for peace, and what can peace do for food security? This is a relationship that we want to bring forth here, and because food security here mainly is an implementation vehicle, is a raison d'etre of peace. We need to work on its structural causes. It stabilizes transition process where relationships are quite tough. It's a space where people can collaborate and where people are able to go back to the places where we're displaced. But also, food security depends on peace building because we need a little bit of stability in order to have new relations. We need violence to end, organized violence to end, to start to implement. Sometimes we need to create that first meeting place between actors, then afterwards we can dynamize, but we also need to create it. That is fundamental, and this means to have structural reforms. And also we need to think about plans in the mid to long term. Now, the conflict sometimes makes us think about food security in the short term. Now, some final points. Now, for us, it is key to broaden this reflection. I mean, this is not something that we have right now, but this is open to conversation. And we're going to need to dynamize these topics. For example, the territorial grounding. How can we ground all of these concepts? We also think that this can contribute to the triple nexus, and this is a debate that is tough, a complex debate. But if we have the vehicle of food security, we can have huge impact. And last, we need to have knowledge from the point of view of implementation. I mean, we need to build knowledge based on the implementation. I mean, we always know the vest that reaches remote places in Colombia, and this means we need to pick up information that many people don't have. That's what we want to do, build reality from the ground up. Thank you very much.
Mateo, muchas gracias.
Mateo, thank you very much for your presentation. Brilliant presentation. Now, next, and before continuing, we like to remind the people that are looking at us through the YouTube channel, we have translation available in Spanish, English, and French. And also, the chat is open for you to write down any questions or observations in your corresponding language. And at the end of the session, we are gonna give you a little bit of time to try to answer or comment upon any observations. Now, the next presentation is part of the study made within the Hunger and Conflict Project, and in this case, it is work that has done in collaboration with the Danish Council for Refugees, focused on the impact of landmines that has an impact in many populations and the food security of many populations in Colombia. And for this, Maria Camila Granados has the floor. She's a researcher from the Investigation, Knowledge and Information Unit of Action Against Hunger, Colombia. So go ahead, Maria Camila. So, hello everyone. So we're going to start to tell you by stating that this report made this year, called Explosive Artifacts and Food Security, the Dynamics in the Framework of the Armed Conflict in Colombia, is an attempt to try to generate knowledge. It is basically a report made jointly with the Danish Refugee Council that seeks to comprehend the implications that this type of explosive artifacts have in the day-to-day lives of communities in the territory, and specifically in relation to food security. And basically it encompasses rural communities. So this type of coordination in order to generate knowledge is vital, because these two organizations has two areas of expertise, long dated, and DRC, and also food security. I mean, we all know that we are experts on it, as people have stated today. And it has a general objective that all our research try to achieve, that generate evidence-based data in order to establish the relationship that exists between food insecurity and Resolution 1417. Now, methodologically speaking, I'm gonna try to mention where this report comes from. We try to use qualitative and quantitative data. We visited territories where demining has taken place in order to get to know the perspective of communities, teams, and institutions. We had interviews with many actors that work in demining, and also we use something that we have, our own information. I mean, we produce information in terms of non-technical studies. I mean, also DRC. It is basically detailed studies that allows us to identify or suspicion of a presence of explosive artifacts, and our data, as Mateo mentioned, in the MIRE, which is an emergency response mechanism that is activated when there is an armed conflict emergency. We have certain limitations, they tend to happen, and sometimes we have lack of information and also certain limitations when reaching places where there is armed conflict and where it is quite intense. It's hard to get there. So I'm going to start by mentioning the current panorama in Colombia, basically divided into three topics: the armed conflict, food security is number two. We already seen a couple of global figures, and also land demining. And in relation to armed conflict, as we've already seen, as of 2017, it basically is the starting milestone for this research. The conflict changes nature after the negotiations and the signature of the peace accords, where armed groups become atomized. And the Red Cross Committee recognized 8 armed conflicts, non-international ones, and the Ideas for Peace Foundation mentions 11 nucleus of dispute, territories where more than one group, at least 2 groups, are actually challenging each other for social and economic control, for illicit economies, etc. And also there has been an increase of 54% in confrontations that have an impact mainly on the civilian population because they are mainly between factions. All of this takes place, as we saw earlier, in parallel exercise in order to generate peace negotiation in the framework of total peace. Now, the current food insecurity panorama in Colombia. Here are certain figures for Colombia. 25% of the population suffers from food insecurity. 1.6 million people in Colombia suffer from severe food insecurity, and 51% suffer from marginal food insecurity. That is, at the edge of things. What does this mean? Greater vulnerability when suffering different shocks or different factors such as inflation, conflict, extreme climate change, the economic crisis, etc., etc. And we've also evinced the permanence of the consequences of the conflict in food insecurity. That is, 44% of the households victim of the conflict are in a food insecurity situation, 20 more percentage points than those homes that are not. In addition to this, these dynamics of food insecurity start to overlap or converge with the dynamics or presence of landmines. Now, now we're going to go to the next slide. The third panorama. I mean, everything's happening at the same time. The presence and use of explosive artifacts. And in Colombia, we have identified more than 12 types of explosive artifacts that are basically characterized by, first of all, the intent of harming, and sometimes are activated by the victim, but also this diversity makes them hard to detect because these are artifacts that are manufactured artisanally and have had a presence throughout the conflict. And in the second place, we estimate that there are 10 kilometers of a contaminated area. This is estimate. There are no baselines. We don't have enough records to confirm this, but basically we consider it is 10 kilometers of contaminated areas. Now, as of 21, Colombia has been part of the Convention about the prohibition of the employment, storage, production, and transfer of these artifacts. Even in the strategic plan that we have, Colombia creates regulatory frameworks and strategic plans for Colombia free from mines in order to coordinate demining actions in order to support victims and to provide education as to the risks of landmines. And this leads the agency comprehensive action against landmines. He has a seat at the higher ranks of government, and it allows us to coordinate with other policies of reparations. And this is related to what we mentioned today, is basically that we need to build scenarios that enable peace. And now let's continue. Let's look into detail the historical presence of these devices in the country. Up to now, 12,429 victims. We had considerable peaks approximately in the 2000s, but you can see that after 2017, this figure started to go on the rise again. And 40.6% of these victims are people from, are civilians basically. And the rest, basically 56%, are members of the armed forces. It is important also to understand that we need to read age. Fourth part of these victims are children or teenagers, minors basically, and 12.6% of the victims live in ethnic territories. This is an overexposure and over impact because the ethnic population in Colombia with the census is not more than 7% of the total population. However, here they are the 12% of the victims. So we see that the use of these artifacts has a long history registered from 1990, but it changes. For example, as of 2017, there is something happening. The proportion of victims starts to invert between victims and armed forces and the civilians. The civilian population is no longer 40%, but almost the 70% of the victims. And in second place, one of our findings is that they're still using landmines as a strategy of war. And we have registered a couple of these years 4,000 events. Perhaps it's an accident or not, but it leads to 575 accidents that lead to 926 victims. And we see a trend where the presence of these phenomenon increases in rural areas specifically. Now 99.5% of these accidents happen in rural areas, and not any. We're talking about rural area that are basically remote in Colombia with low population density, hard to access protective services, health services, etc., etc. And here we can see there is an increase of the impact on ethnic populations. In what territories? Well, especially Antioquia, but specifically also Nariño, Putumayo, and Santander of the North. And the result is the following. There's a convergence of the geographies that involve the use of explosive artifacts and also conflict areas. So here we see the areas where a certain group basically rules over the land, and also areas of dispute that converge with the areas of greater victimization. And during 2022 and 2023, it's not only the landmines and explosive artifacts are still used as a strategy of war, because it is a really efficient strategy for war. They are built with materials that are easy to get. It has a huge impact in terms of damages. They have huge permanence in the territory because these artifacts sometimes just lay there for 20 years or more. But we've also noticed that during these 2 years, the presence of these artifacts or suspicion of their being there has increased. Now, in the intersectorial response mechanism, 92% of the reported emergencies that we attended to in 2023 reported the presence or suspicion of IDs. So, for example, 40% of the municipalities that reported accidents in 2023 didn't report accidents in the previous year, so it's a possible contamination. And finally, the suspicion of landmines increases in 241. Now, what is the result for the actors that are actually demining in Colombia. And it's a huge challenge. It's not impossible, but it's huge. And their challenge is to demine in situations where the conflict is active. For example, 12% of the national territory is as yet to prioritize because they don't have enough security conditions in order to carry out demining. And the territories that have a greater presence of landmines and impact are not available for demining right now. And this is even more serious because humanitarian demining can be perceived as an enabling policy. It becomes the first steps for investment policies, the development of productive processes, reparation policies, and returning to the territory. Now, taking this into account, so let's stop separating the boxes and let's see how all of this panorama converge as well as this information, and to understand what is the impact of explosive artifacts in terms of food security. Now, the explosive artifacts follow a military logic where they seek to restrict the access to resources, damage, or cause harm to the opponent. So, where can we find them?
Well, fields, mountains, hills, well, 28% transit. And we are talking about dispersed rural area, we're talking about roads, villages, roads, and also transit areas in a rural zone. So in third place, resources that are strategic in the logic of our confrontations. Those are water capturing around rivers, tension areas for wood to cook and transformation of foods, and so telecommunications. What happens from that logic that responds to confrontation? And as we saw this, civilians are still the most vulnerable people for this type of dynamics. So despite the fact that all this responds to a logic that could be called a military, 56% of civilian people end up injured and being victims due to these artifacts while they are doing actions or activities related to food security. And what type of activities we see this in terms of food security within availability? Food production, go and see those crops, go and change livestock and animals of those if we see transit areas, go to those municipalities to provide food or trade, amongst others, even the roads and the transit from one part to another to perform labor or rural work and any type of agricultural activity. And with strategic civilian population use water capture around superficial sources and also access for wood in forest, around forest areas. So what would be those impacts on the availability? We know that 90% are doing, well, this percentage is even more because we don't have enough information about what the victim was doing, 40% of these moments. But what can we see in terms of availability? As people can identify that there's an artifact. The first one is identification for a reference or local information. Well, a group was camping. You can see artifacts or elements that don't correspond, cables, amongst other things. What does this takes to? This takes that people will have facing strategies that are really reduced, trying to signalize, to have that area, and that the use of area in most of the cases abandoning and displacing the area where they live. So it's not only the presence, because suspecting and having a suspicious about someone is circulating, people will no longer use that area in accordance to data of action against land mining. Only a suspicious of an artifact restricts the use of 8,269 square meters, and this will be getting shorter. So the average of the confirmed dangerous area is low when you confirm a contamination, but what's most important that only in 36% of this big total, we have an explosive artifact. So the suspicious per se and the fear around the communities are enough reason for not using more productive areas. To do the analysis in terms of availability, we have technical reports that have DRC, and 90% of these areas that are no longer using were a source of income and property families around rural areas, and 85% had agricultural and livestock uses. And if you see this, when they are using demining processes, what people are waiting to do with this, 80% of cases are waiting to go back and recover their productive activities. Added to this, we have that apart from abandoning the use of the area that they have, it also decreased the value of the land. The presence of a mine or a suspicion of a landmine decreases the value, not only for investment, for development of productive projects between a diversity of more elements that could strengthen, only for suspicious for land mining. And also it also directly affects other productive goods, for example, animals. And this is not practically documented. Only 1.8% of animal-related accidents or incidents involve animals. But what do animals represent in an economy, in a family economy? Animals, in terms of access, can be the most important means of transport. In terms of livestock, it can represent other species. They can be for sale or selling, or also they are also for self-consumption or for selling. After this, we talk about the affectations to cultural processes of food production. 12% of the areas, the presence, suspicion of an artifact, an explosive artifact implies blockages to cultural practices or sacred sites. And additional to this, it harms and affects cultural practices such as bread crops, self-consumption, loss of livestock, grazing areas, and blockades in ancestral territories. For example, for the availability of medicinal plants in indigenous communities, we can see that geographies of mining, land mining, due to the differential ethnics, converge with territories in Colombia. Indigenous safeguards and Afro-descendant communities, most importantly. So we can see those livelihood losses in terms of productions, food availability, but let's see the losses in terms of their livelihoods, what people do as a livelihood. And let's in accordance to MIDE, there's a great diversification of the different portfolios of what families do for livelihood, independence on agricultural activities, and selling also their labor or work. They also have the self-consumption, what they crop for themselves and harvest for themselves, and economies such as mining, natural resources, and illegal economies that are around their resource. So this is diverse rural labor, contracting, etc. And here, mines that are usually given at the same time of some reduced mobility are affecting directly these other activities that will not be produced or developed in my lot, that I need to move myself between different villages in order to sell my work, my labor, what I produce. Additional to this, let's think about rurality in Colombia, which are activities highly demanding in terms of physical consequences. So the affectations in terms of losses, injuries, and deaths restrict the productive activities as well. 15% of victims reported amputation of a limb, and 29% reported reported a leg injury. But let's talk about a community or a population that cannot produce everything by themselves. So this is the access to markets, so they can have access to goods, services, to trade what I produce, amongst other factors. And 77% of that access to market is by foot or horseback, and generally it takes more than 1 and 3 hours from the last populated place the last populated place. What are those strategies that communities take? Generally, they take two. First of all, they build new routes. This implies more times and more costs because this route has a presence or suspicion for contamination, and the second one is to narrowing those roads. And this presents a difficulty when we talk about mobility with livestock, animals, mobility with children in a daily basis. Finally, we also have direct affectations that show that link between the presence or suspicious of explosive the artifacts and food security in the transformation and the consumption of food. And the first one is the decrease in the dietary diversity of communities. From the evaluations, we discovered that 69% of the indigenous people had no access to proteins. And this is due to the fact that it constitutes the report and the access to protein. We have hunting, which is produced in forests in different difficult accesses. We have fishing activities and self-production. If there's some landmines that it prevents this access, well, they would be directly affected to this diet. And also emergencies that are being attended that have a highly affectation to landmines. People end up depending highly on foods. And finally, the obstacles that imply to water and firewood. 184 victims of accidents in harvesting activities, and this is even higher in indigenous territories because 6.2% of explosive artifacts are found around these areas. However, here we have a trend with this the masculinization of these figures. 92% of victims are men. So understanding the impact that this has on rural women requires another scope, requires involving other elements as well. For example, inequalities, structural inequalities in access to resources with respect to the gaps within sex, occupation and economic independence of women in households, and also sexual division of labor and care work. So we can see here in inequalities to access resources. Rural property in women is of 87% informality for rural property. Nationally speaking, it's 52%. We have 30 points more. This means that there are more risks to abandon and isolating leads for women, occupation and economic independence. There's a rate, the labor participation on paid occupations where women are within 74% of this rate of unemployment. However, women have 2 times more their times to occupy, especially in rural areas on domestic work. All of this in a landscape where most of them with women are in a poverty which is multidimensional. Having all this in mind, let's see what are the victims that these explosive artifacts have over rural women and their households. And we have two important conclusions. Women are victims directly and indirectly, and we need to start with the premise that in terms on conflict settings, violence usually makes severe with these sex gaps. And how can we see this? 100% of these women were civilians. Any women in terms of work vinculated to masculinized works as eradication of illicit crops or in terms of confrontations with public force. And additional to this, territoriality of affectation of these women is higher in terms of Chocó and Nariño. This gives us the need to adopt an intersectorial scope because 42% of women are rural and are indigenous, 8% are rural and Afro-descendant. Added to this, we also have a capacity in rural settings that are decreased. From the productive units, 74, almost 75% are managed exclusively by men. But why? I would like to clarify why we talk about victims, direct victims and indirect victims. Direct victims because these are victims from the same artifact detonation, and indirect victims because in accordance to UNMAS, for each direct victims, there are 4.5% of his or her become indirect victims and are harmed. Who are those victims that are taking back their responsibilities of caring transition, because many times for a direct victim we can lose livelihoods and incomes and also territoriality. To stay in that territory, they are going to be adopted most importantly by women. Having all this landscape, we come like to a conclusion, an important conclusion. First of all, a double affectation in terms of direct victims and indirect victims. And second, that women, rural women, are facing greater obstacles in adopting coping strategies or negotiating because they need to bargain limited resources. They also have the areas that are notable more lower than the productive units that are managed by men, and this will make things severe of how can they address this crisis as well. Finally, having all this in mind, apart from facing this, we have some conclusions. Instead of concluding, we want to provide recommendations, and there are general recommendations that drive these investigations that we have been working on. It's that the need to strengthen the collection and systematizing information that will allow to explore this type of links between food insecurity and the conflict, food insecurity and the presence or suspicious of explosive artifacts, uh, insecurity, peace, as well as others. And the recommendations, particularly, we have for each one of the sectors. For example, in front of the government, we have the need to position the relationship between demining in the short, medium, and long-term processes to guarantee the food security of communities through public policies. Second, consolidate emergency demining processes in confined communities, especially those that are confined or displaced, and raise the positioning of the thematic area in the dialogue agenda when we have a suspicion of explosive devices. On the other hand, to the humanitarian organizations, it's talking specifically in terms of demining and food security, establishing intervention strategies focused on the food security around context of reduced mobility related to explosive artifacts, restrictions to mobility, confined movement, and displacement. Second, working strategies on short and medium term for the recovery of livelihoods and strengthening food security in contaminated areas. And third, starting to adopt a differential approach to allow those effects, the impacts around the contamination on women, children, adolescents, for ethnic groups as well. And finally, and I believe we go back to the beginning of this session, looking demining in Colombia as an exercise from a nexus approach as a part of a humanitarian intervention that from the assistance security food that will promote and address security goals that leads to development and peace building processes. Thank you so much. Okay, thank you, Maria Camila Granados. Well, she has provided a very good explanation. We have some questions that have been written or given by YouTube channel that is transmitting in English. I'm not, please, uh, please excuse us because we won't be able to respond them all, but we will be answering. Well, let's start with the first one. What has been the impact of food security in this last year? I don't know if Cristina, you want to answer this question? Yes, thank you so much for your question. I'm going to try to answer it briefly. Yes, this is a topic where we can go so much deeper, but yes, a lot, we have a lot to say. From 2022, the number of people that increased in terms of hunger figures is 22 million. Not only is the increase of hunger figures, but it's what's most concerning is that hunger is getting more severe, as we have talked around this morning session, most importantly due to the impact of armed conflicts. One of the groups that are most affected by this reality are displaced people, not only internally but abroad due to conflicts. And around this, we have women and children. Well, just to say two examples about this reality. One is Sudan. From the beginning of war, 15th of April 2023, this food security has deteriorated so badly that currently half of its population is facing hunger figures, which is acute. In food security, we work with a score, with a classification that establishes 5 levels of severeness for hunger, starting with a no risk, stable food security, until level 5, which would be famine, catastrophe, and death risk. Half of the population in Sudan is in level 3, currently speaking. This is acute malnutrition with great vulnerability to go to elevated levels of hunger. In fact, around 800,000 people are in this level 5 of hunger, acute hunger. So I think this is an illustrative example, apart from concerning, Gaza border previous to October 2023, the rates of malnutrition, children malnutrition, were low. However, with the intensification of conflict in a period of time that's relatively short, of children under 5 years old, we see all of them under a situation of acute and severe malnutrition that puts them in risk. So, unfortunately, we find different examples of how hunger has been deteriorated in this last year. And as we have said before, in different ways, uh, related to the increase of conflicts, violence, and all this situation of instability around contexts that are vulnerable and armed conflicts that are active right now. I hope I answered the question. And now the next question, please. Now let's move to a question that's more focused in Colombia. Here we are asked, I would like to know today from the humanitarian organizations, what have you do for food security in such complex settings as a Pacific region? I don't know if we have action against hunger in Colombia. Can you respond? Okay. First of all, I would like to say that in many areas in Colombia, many organizations, well, talking and responding secondarily after the authorities, I think in Chocó, in the Pacific, well, these are areas that are particularly vulnerable, but in the mechanism, MIDE, responding to emergency action against hunger, MEDICOS against the world, and the Norwegian Council, we try to intervene around these elements in acute phase, such as we are now, to the floodings that we are seeing. But there are multiple organizations from the forum, from NGOs supporting and assisting, and also the UN, the World Program in the UN that intervenes and assists in these areas. But we see that in these areas, we see particularly areas that are affected. In La Guajira, even in La Guajira, by other causes as well, we have food insecurity that at times can be really concerning. Okay, thank you, John. Well, any question that we have here in this room before we can start to close with Manuel, who we want to invite here to conclude now.
No hay
So there's no questions. There's no live questions then. Okay, then Manuel, we invite you to finish up. So yes, we're basically right on time. So the first message that I need to give is an institutional one, because the nexus that we mentioned is a nexus that right now is being built with the academia that has become militant. They decided that they want to work in terms of reconciliation, and this means that our conversation with the humanitarian domain and the peace-building domain turns research into something that is pertinent, and for me this is very important to state it. So in this sense, I believe that in this we agree with the team of Action Against Hunger. We realize that the information that we produce needs to be pertinent in order to be able to build peace, and we already have a short set of ideas that I want to provide. 11 years ago, when we organized our first report, that included research in relation to confinement, we found that, as you mentioned before, there was a distance from the last place where people were able to access food. On average, the places where we studied, it was 20 kilometers, between 2 or 3 hours in normal conditions. During the confinement events, and I mean, in average. So it was quite hard. It was quite hard to live in a place that was impacted by structural violence. And when direct violence actually becomes part of the reality, it extends the time. So it's not only a question of distance, but how much you don't have access to. And this made us think about that direct relationship between hunger and conflict, with a thing that I consider important that is worth mentioning. Now that you've provided information about the local and national context of the 8 armed conflicts that we are suffering right now in the post-conflict, and the fact that in that same research we were able to verify that it was a shared responsibility, not only between illegal actors, but also legal actors, that of course hindered the access or the distribution of food to many places. This made relative many ways of thinking this reality in a moment where the country had 50,000 people that were confined. That was 11 years ago, and today the figures have increased to 250,000. It's a situation that has not changed, but fortunately, the meeting place between academia and the humanitarian space has allowed it to produce important pieces of information. And in order to talk about peace building, we also need to talk about a short and a broad concept of peace building. I mean, we can think that peace building is done in the post-conflict and also have a deep awareness of how much time people have been building peace in this country. And here it is very important to recognize that precisely in that domain of post-conflict, where we have greater levels of food security, as we had 18 during the signature of the peace accords. I mean, 18 people murdered for 100,000, and now it's 26. So that situation that apparently is paradox is quite common in a post-conflict country. I mean, violence increases in that scenario, reason for which today social organizations describes that we have more or less 93 actors, armed actors, illegal actors. This is a very important amount. In the United Nations they mention 140, and you might understand that it feeds this situation where we see armed confrontations that need to be resolved. So there's a concept of peace building, and it needs to go through daring to resolve those conflicts in a context that I consider worth writing about, because it's paradoxical that right now possible negotiations are being broadened to places that we didn't consider in the past. I mean, it's hard to say this morally, but it is also true the fact that what apparently has been the most effective in terms about signing peace accords are those new experiences that are taking place with non-rebel organizations. Well, it pleases me to say it, but I'm just stating this due to necessity. I mean, we've met together due to the necessity in order to produce relevant information, and we need to know that the context of this country is one that we need to face from certain domains related to policy, and that's why I was interested in all of the recommendations that were made. And once again, it's something that I want to say. There's a particular tension. We work with the Norwegian Research Institute for Peace. Right now there's an ongoing research, and also in relation to humanitarian associations. And one of the things that we have been able to confirm is that there's a tension between large organizations that go to serve certain problems, and sometimes organizations have methods that, I mean, I don't know, I want to use the word that is localization, but there's certain different methods that organizations use, and this generates tension. But we need to think about it to see how people adapt and how they enter into humanitarian negotiations with legal actors. And this is a research that is done also in the ethics department. This is not done from a political point of view or analytical one. We are just considering what are all of the ethical implications of it. And we're doing this with the Peace Research Institute. And this leads us to understand that on the one hand, we need to reconsider what it means in terms of thinking locally, and also the size, because size matters, you know. And on the other hand, there's a reflection. How can we start to generate advocacy from this point of view? I've always said in many places that when one mentions humanitarian interventions and impartiality and neutrality, I always say if you're working for the victims, you already have a political position. So why not? Why not? Don't we start to generate advocacy that can also lead international humanitarian law to become a type of measuring rod in order to assess every single negotiation process that takes place? And this generates a tension between talking about peace building related to what is done after the conflict, and also broader peace building within this context. That's everything that I need to do for now. I believe that's enough, and thank you very much. So, well then, I believe we can finish this space. I'd like to thank the people that have been here with us, people that were in the Spanish, English, and French transmission. Unfortunately, we apologize not being able to answer all of the questions. However, we invite you to communicate with the emails that you're seeing on the screen, and if you need or you wish to access more information, you can go to Action Against Hunger webpage. Thank you very much for being with us here today, and once again, we will meet again in other events that we organize. Well, have a good day.